Glad you're here. If you're visiting or you come all the time, we're glad to be here together today. I hope it's not too hot for you. We didn't get a nice strong monsoon to cool it off, so hang in there. I'll try to talk a little shorter so we can get out of here quick. That's the dream, right? It's not going to happen. Hey, if you're visiting with us, we always do the same thing before we start the message. We always pray for another church in town or around the world because that's part of our DNA. It's central to what we believe, that we're just a tiny segment of a very diverse and beautiful living amoeba thing around this planet called the body of Christ. And so we love praying for our brothers and sisters that don't meet in this gathering but elsewhere. So today, if you're the praying type, you can join me. We're going to lift up Canyon Chapel and my good friends Rich and Maggie over there, who I love dearly. So let's lift them up. God, thank you for this day, and thank you as always for the freedoms we take for granted to so openly and freely talk about you. We thank you, God, for so many in our family that meet together in different buildings and different gatherings, but all centrally sharing in common your love for us and our response to that. God, we pray today for Canyon Chapel, Lord. I thank you so much for Rich and Maggie. Thank you for the way they reflect you so clearly in their love and servants' hearts. And we pray for all that gather over there that are our family. Just bless them, let them be aware that they are loved. And we always pray, God, draw us closer to all of them as we're all drawing close to you. And we also pray, Lord, as we open the Bible today, we open our minds and our eyes and our ears for what you might have for us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, how many of you were at the Commons camp out on Friday night? See if anybody has recovered and made it here in time. I see some hands out there. It was pretty epic. I was actually pretty surprised. I had just got back in town. I got out there a little bit late, but it was a great group of people. We had a lot of fun. I don't know, how many people do we think were out there? What? 40-ish? So that's where we're going. I thought that was pretty great to go camp out and hang out around the fire. We played some cornhole. Me and Alana smoked, I think it was Eli and Alex. Just want to point that out. How old's Alana? Like 9, Eli? Yeah, just wanted to keep pointing that out. Smoked those guys. That was pretty fun. Had a good fire, good hangout time. Really, honestly, it felt like church. It felt like the real thing. One of the things we talk about a lot in here, and by the way, today we'll talk a little bit about church philosophy because of the book that we've chosen, but really we always try to point out that this gathering on Sunday is not church. You are church. I am church. People. Church is people, not a building or a program or a gathering. And so for me, sometimes when something sweet comes together like that, we're all sitting around a campfire and sharing stories and hearing people talking about that's church. That's the real deal. So that was cool. I got to share a story there. It's not funny or that interesting. I mean, I think it's interesting, but I was sitting there talking to my brother Trey and Ken and Beth and a couple other people because I had just come back from New Mexico that day. Because my kids, I don't know how many of you knew this, but my kids were gone in Texas with their grandparents for a week. And the week before that, I was speaking at a camp in Florida. So for 2 weeks, I wasn't with my children. And I'm with my children all the time because my wife works full time. I'm kind of a stay-at-home dad a lot. We have kind of crazy schedules. And I was aching for my kids. And you that are moms and dads know what that's like. I could not wait to get them. So I woke up Friday morning. I drove to Albuquerque. And I ran into Cracker Barrel. Don't judge me. I love Cracker Barrel. I'm from the South. It's just a reality. And as I went back in the back, my 4 kids saw me, and they came running across Cracker Barrel. They tackled me, and it was really awkward because we were near like 3 tables, and we were in the middle of them all. And they were piled up on me, and it was like one of those thin veils for me between heaven and earth to hold my children again. It was such a sweet moment. And we had, eggs or whatever we had, and we loaded up in the car and cruised. It continued to be a really sweet moment for me because my kids were so excited to tell me all about their week in Texas. They couldn't believe it was 100 degrees and raining at the same time. It just blew their minds. And they were explaining to me that they went to the soccer camp. Marco's mom got them into the soccer camp, actually at my old university, and they were just saying, we really like soccer camp, but we would really like to try one in Flagstaff next time because the heat was unbearable. They're just not used to humidity, but they just talked, and I was just soaking it up. It was really cool. Well, eventually they wore out in the long road trip, and we're driving, and they're getting tired, and 2 kids would sleep, the other 2 be awake talking, and finally I realized that we were kind of at that road trip point where we needed a break. And since I'm a creative, unbelievably loving dad, I do really cool things all the time. And so we stopped at this truck stop in Gallup, New Mexico. So I decided that we were going to have a soccer match at the truck stop because that's a great venue for soccer matches. So we went inside, went to the bathroom, got drinks, and what were we going to do? We came outside, and I said, all right, guys, we're going to go. And it was about 98 degrees, and the sun shining. Let's go back here. And Aspen was like, back there in the dirt with all the trash? I was like, yeah, that's all part of it. I'm a fun dad. Let's go do this. Let's force it even though no one wants to do it. So we go back there, and there's kind of nasty puddles and trash everywhere and dust where it's not wet. And we're kicking the soccer around for about all of maybe 15 seconds of me forcing fun on my children. And all of a sudden, Colt spots in the puddle that there's life forms in the puddle. So soccer game off, we have now discovered the purpose for our existence. We go around this puddle, and what it is tadpoles. You know, you guys know tadpoles. Some of you weirdos probably call them polywogs, which is weird. But there was a bunch of tadpoles in this puddle, which is neat because my kids don't see that very often. I love Flagstaff. You know that if you've been around me. I love this place more than any human could. But we don't have a ton of tadpoles and frogs, so I thought this is a great chance to play with these guys. So we got all muddy trying to get around the edge of this nasty truck stop puddle and get a hold of these tadpoles. We did, and I was trying to explain to Sierra and Blaze that this would eventually become a frog. That is not possible to understand before you get to school, so just don't waste your time on young for that. But as we go along, Colt says, hey, check out that tadpole. So I reach in there and I grab this tadpole, and I look down, and in my hand is a hideous creature that I have never before seen in my life. So I was at the campfire, at the Commons campfire, and I was trying to explain this creature to Ken and Trey and some people around the campfire, and they were saying, I was like, well, I don't even know how to Google it. I don't even know how to find out what this creature was. And so I pulled my phone out and I Googled puddle creature, which is like, you have a lot of faith in Google to be able to answer all of your questions with no connections. But to my shock and surprise, the very first image that pops up when you Google puddle creature is this. Maybe this. This is called a triops, okay? And it's really pretty cool. You can't tell, but this is what I was holding in my hand, thinking it was a tadpole, which it was not. It's some sort of mixture of a scorpion and stingray death star or something. And when you flip it over, that red stuff is like a living lung. It's just breathing up and down and kind of wiggling all around. So it's pretty freaky. Kids all want to play with it. We played with it a while. So anyway, I got to researching this, and this is actually how I'm going to force a transition to talking about what we're going to talk about today. It was pretty cool. After this, the first link on Google went to a New Mexico news station that says prehistoric animal discovered in the puddles of New Mexico. And so I clicked on this link and we watched the video. There's an anchor in Albuquerque, New Mexico talking about how at this truck stop outside of Albuquerque, we were in Gala, they've discovered a triops, which is a 300-million-year-old creature. And their eggs can lie dormant for, get this, 80 years. For 80 years, it'll just lay there until the monsoon rains come around. And they're usually found in Southeast Asia, parts of South America, and somehow New Mexico, America. And so we had found one. I was basically holding a dinosaur in my hand. 300 million years old, these things have successfully survived all that's happened to this planet. So it's really a pretty cool thing. Now here's the forced transition I'm going to try to make from that. What we're going to look at today is a book by Jen Hatmaker. And the book is called Interrupted, and I'll just tell you right away that I think this book is amazing, a really well written book. Now, by the way, if you're visiting with us, let me just take a step back. We do a summer book club series, and we have a vote where people on Facebook nominate a book, and then everybody votes by liking, and so I'm kind of forced to just do whatever you choose. And this week, it was actually pretty intense. I don't know if you guys were watching. Probably all week long, you just stared at Facebook watching the vote to see what would happen, because it was a Donald Miller book up against this Jen Hatmaker book to the very end. But this book is a lot like a triops. Here's my forced transition. Here's what I mean. She has a revolutionary idea, and the name of the book is Interrupted right here. And I think the tagline of the book says, when Jesus wrecks your comfortable Christianity. So she's kind of thrown out there right away that she's got this idea that will transform the way we see Christianity. And I submit that she succeeds in her thesis. You can see all the little tabs here. I had to read this today and just gulp it down as quick as I can. But the thing is, she doesn't actually bring something new to the table. She didn't discover a new creature. It's almost like she found a dinosaur. It's almost like she revisits the real grassroots, authentic basis of Christianity that should be the very central connection point to all of us have to this whole narrative, which is the Jesus story. And it is a very, very well-written book. I highly recommend it. Now, what I love about this, Mark has been trying to get me to read this book for a while. I love Jen Hatmaker. Some of you may not be familiar with her. She's a mom blogger. She's married to a pastor in Austin, Texas. So part of me connecting you to this book might have a couple of things that you need to know up front. I lived in Austin, Texas. I know the culture she's talking about and writing about. I also really like sassy, strong Texas women, which is what she is. And if you're not from there and you don't know what a strong Texas woman is like, you need to read this book even if you don't care about the theology of it. need to be introduced to this sort of personality, because she is that. And most importantly, more important than any of the content of this book, she's hilarious. And that's all you need to know. You should never respect or listen to anyone that doesn't have a sense of humor. And that's basically the best value she has. In fact, here's my guilty pleasure confession. One of which, by the way, I'm sweating like because it is crazy hot on the stage, so forgive that. I'm going to be doing this the whole time. But here's the other thing. Because I'm kind of a stay-at-home mom, I read her blog all the time. I'm just going to throw it out there. I love Jen Hatmaker. I love every story she tells about cooking and taking her kids to PTA meetings, whatever. I'm all in. So if you're a guy, you're just going to have to get over that right now. I'm all in on Jen Hatmaker. She's super funny. She's a great thinker. But what she brings to this book, which has great value, is it's not explicit, but implicitly this book is a journey about why and how they started a church in Austin, Texas. What's kind of cool, and I don't think this was the intent by choosing this book, is it very much echoes the formation of the Commons here in Flagstaff. So it's a pretty interesting read for me personally, selfishly. I really enjoyed hearing about the journey her husband and she went on as they were challenged and interrupted, which is the idea their life was interrupted, and they rethought about what church should be. And she's very clear, this is not about her local church in the same way that I'm always clear. We're not talking about the Commons. We're talking about the church, the global church, all denominations, all expressions, the Christian church that believes in the central creeds of who Jesus was and what that meant to the cosmos. So it's a pretty cool idea. Now, I want to start at the very beginning. You can see I've used up all these colored tabs. Trust me, we're not going to go through all that. There's just a couple that I want to read to you, a couple sections. And by the way, we had a little technology malfunction over here, so we're not going to have any verses or any of the text up there. So you're going to have to actually listen with your ears, which might explode your brain. Here we go. This is kind of her thesis at the very beginning. She's calling out to readers. She says, if you're plagued with tension or discontent or a nagging sense that there must be more, that there has to be a faith somewhere that rings true, hopeful, and gracious, a faith other than this mean, ugly, partisan, judgmental, self-indulgent version of Christianity, which has to be total bunk, then get down on your knees and thank your lucky stars. God has blessed you with this inner conflict. He isn't leaving you in complacency and boredom to check boxes and do church. He has enlisted you in the cause of your generation and is calling you forward, you lucky thing. I can't use her Texas accent anymore. I've worked too hard to get rid of mine. You will not be left and lost, wondering what all this fuss is about, wishing things would never change. And again, later on, there's something else that I thought was kind of summed up the whole idea, her critique, because by the way, kind of echoing in the background of this book, and I like this as long as it's done appropriately, because you know that I'm all about this, is a loving critique of the American Christian church. Part of the whole purpose is saying, I get really sick of Texas Christianity. I get really sick of just doing church and climbing up the ladder so people will see me and respect me. That's a major theme of this whole book. And she gets sick of a lot of the ways in which Christianity looks to the rest of the world when we basically live as culture's moral police and morality police, and we're judgmental, and that's what people see. By the way, she's not calling for some sort of blanket relativism either, but she is noticing and recognizing the church has a problem. Here's a little example, one other thing that she wrote. It says, the world is increasingly uninterested in our Christian story. Our current presentation is just not compelling. Most believers who represent it battle boredom and apathy. They're spiritually immature and demonstrate religiosity without transformation. We launch public shame grenades with abandon and claim to love the sinner but hate the sin, which translates to, we are enormous pompous jerks. Our faith communities run the gamut from judgmental high church to feel-good talent shows, and people aren't buying anymore. Remarkably, most outsiders are not anti-church. Our gospel isn't provocative enough to incite backlash anymore. They simply dismiss the church as irrelevant to their real lives, since it seems most irrelevant to the people who go there. And then I'm going to skip over to this section. She says, this is my high calling, to live on mission as an adopted daughter of Jesus. If people around me aren't moved by my Christ or my church, then I must be doing a miserable job of representing them both. That's just a little sample. I'm not going to read any more of hers until we get to the very end, of kind of the thesis of her book. She's recognizing something that a lot of us recognize here, that Christianity has in some ways been a giant, huge failure of an embarrassment in our culture. Because we have forgotten the dinosaur. We've forgotten the original ancient source. We've forgotten Jesus. And one of the things I love about this book is she begins, the whole first 2/3 of the book are centrally focused on the life of Jesus. And I'm not going to read the scripture, but she begins telling her own story about praying a prayer about not being fulfilled enough and knowing that there's more and asking God to rise up a holy passion in her. And then all of a sudden she's reading through a story that she's read 10,000 times. Peter being restored, if you remember in John 21, after the resurrection of Christ, Peter has denied Jesus 3 times. He's been embarrassed of Jesus 3 times, denied him. And then they're cooking breakfast and some fish. He's talking to the resurrected Jesus, and Jesus keeps asking him over and over again, Peter, do you love me? 3 times. He says, of course, you know I love you. And they have this repeated conversation. It's significant that there's 3 times that Jesus asked Peter, Peter, do you love me? Yes. And he keeps saying one thing in response, and this is what floored Jen Hatmaker. Jesus kept saying, then feed my sheep. And even though she'd seen it 10,000 times, it was the first time it registered to her that that's a really weird response of Jesus to this question, do you love me? Yeah, I do. Then feed my sheep. Because see, she and her husband, she is a very much poster child of American Christianity. And what I love about her is her sense of humor about herself. She's really good at self-debacle, or what do you call that? What is that called when you become yourself? Yeah, self-deprecating. It's very good. There's a vocabulary king over there. So she's good at that. And she's processing through the fact that she has grown up the poster child of Christianity. She's heard it all before. And then she realized for the first time in her life that maybe Jesus was serious to Peter about actually feeding people. Not some sort of spiritual metaphor. Not some sort of you're going to spiritually lead the church and feed them. But actually, maybe underneath all this, Jesus was really, literally serious about taking care of the poor. That's not a shocking message, is it? That shouldn't be a revelation, should it? Well, one of the things she knows is that she had never noticed before that throughout the entire library of 66 books, there are over 2,000 explicit sections and verses that are completely 100% communicating that God is a God who loves the poor and the marginalized. The other thing she notes in here is that the whole world knows this, and that's one of the reasons they're sick of Christianity, because they know enough to know the one thing they know about Jesus is Jesus was all about oppressed people. He was about the marginalized. He was about the farthest out. And then they look at Christians and go, yeah, I'm just not seeing it. It doesn't look like the same message. And I'm going to go now to a scripture passage that she uses to take the point a little further and harder. It's a very difficult passage. It's in Matthew 25, and it's following several parables that Jesus is talking about the sort of relationship that we have with God. And this one has been infamously used as a kind of fear tactic by preachers, especially fundamentalist preachers around the turn of the century and the Great Revival and times like that, to scare people into God's love. And she does an excellent job of explaining that this parable has nothing to do with that. It's not a fear-based thing. It's all about a loving God who will sort out the wheat and tares at the end of time. But he says this, and we'll process it. This is Matthew 25, verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and this is Jesus talking about himself, and by the way, this is really unique. It's not unique that he called himself the Son of Man, which echoed the prophecies of Daniel and other ancient prophets and apocalyptic literature. He always called himself the Son of Man, talking about his humanity and the Son of God, his divinity, all in one thing. But it is unique for a parable for Jesus to be so strictly literal about him coming back in glory at the end. And this is what he says. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. And all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. So this is a shocking, clear picture at the someday element of Christianity. One of the beautiful things about what all Christians agree is the now and not yet theology of Christianity. That somehow Jesus inaugurated the kingdom of God when he came here. He brought to earth God's presence and kingdom, and we're a part of that, but it's not yet fully realized. And this is a very direct glimpse at that someday when everything will be made right and all will be sorted out and all things will be looked back upon in a very different light. And he's talking about how these people that he's honoring, they took care of poor people. They clothed the naked. They visited the imprisoned. This is the Jesus the world already knows about, the one that cares about these things. And then the righteous will answer him because they weren't doing it for any wrong reason. Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty or give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Now, my suspicion is if you've been around churches much in your life, you've been exposed to, or maybe on your own, you've just read this parable or this imagery of Jesus before. There's something very shocking missing from this picture of the end of time. There's no sinner's prayer. There's no baptism. There's no who's in and who's out. There's a blatant, difficult thing for Christians, especially in America, to move around, that the only thing Jesus is interested in talking about at that moment is lives lived significantly for the poor and the oppressed. This is central to the message of Jesus. This is central to the idea of a God who would become incarnate in the meat, in the flesh. He would descend from the heights of whatever the concept of heaven is to the depths of whatever this hellish earth is that we live. God would become a human. He would lower the ladder. And Christianity has always been about going down the ladder, God coming to us instead of us going up to God. And the response is not that we then, after God descends to us, become just like everybody else and try to reascend the ladder. See, once we understand, and this is one of Jen Hatmaker's main thesis in her book, that God descended from all of his glory and took on flesh, which means he also took on suffering and filth and annoyance and humanity and all that it is, including the suffering of the cross and his great love for us. That descent is the one that gives us hope at the end of time, that he is the judge that loves us that much, that would do all that. We don't have to have this fear-based driven thing. And the response should be Christians that also descend. Have you ever thought about that as your mission in life? It's very, very countercultural. Everything about being modern, in fact, one of the critiques I would have of her book is she kind of overly simplifies the history of modernism and postmodernism, but it doesn't matter. Her point is very relevant and true, that everything about the way we are grown up and taught and raised in our entire culture is modern in essence, and postmodern in our response to it, in the sense that we are trying in some way to get up and up and up, and the only way to get up is to make sure someone is below you. And our entire system of government, our entire system of economics, our entire world is driven by the ladder. And her point is, we shouldn't do that anymore. We should descend. We should be incarnate in neighborhoods. We should go where people are. She quotes the famous Thessalonian verse that we shared with you, not only the gospel, but our lives as well. And it's the concept of tabernacling and moving in, that we should move into the neighborhood of the lowest. We should pour out our life. And here's the thing that it's relevant to church, maybe even to our church. Church has to stop being an attractional model. It has to. It doesn't work. And the reason the church is dying in America is because we have this, if you build it, they will come mentality. So we'll put a church, we'll start a church, and then everybody come here so you can experience worship and the Word, which is great. We enjoy this time as celebration and communion with each other, and we enjoy the sacraments. I'm not ditching on that. But the idea is the mission of Jesus has always been go where people are, not try to attract people where you are. And that's often a descent. It's often a humbling. It's often a difficult process. And here's the most important piece of Matthew 25 that rocked her world. Jesus said that he is in the poor. God's presence, his face, is in the lit up eyes of the marginalized and the impoverished and the left behind. And by the way, that's not just Matthew 25. That's the theme of this library. The story's great about sin and redemption and God's unconditional love. If you haven't been here very often, it's pretty much all we ever talk about. But the result, the kingdom now, is that we should be like Jesus. We should be willing to humbly descend and give our lives for the poor. Now, I'm going to read some sections of her books that you're probably aware of. And she's really good, and I'm not as good at her, of giving a lot of really important disclaimers about these stats are not to shame us, they're not to guilt us, but they're just reality that we need to process with as we are Christians who live in our country. This is the stats of the world. And she says, by the way, she did a ton of research on this, and she took the most conservative stats possible of the different multiple sources she found. Of the 6 billion people on planet Earth, about 1.2 billion live on 23 cents a day. Half of the world lives on less than $2.50 a day. The wealthiest 1 billion people average $70 a day. And this places you and me in the upper percentage of the global population. If you make $35,000 annually, you're in the top 4% of planet Earth. If you make $50,000 annually, you're in the top 1%. Someone dies of hunger every 3.6 seconds. Last year, 22 million people died of preventable diseases, and 10 million were children. 27 million children and adults are trapped in slavery, sex slaves, labor slaves, child soldiers, and child slaves because of economic crisis. More slaves exist today than ever before in human history. More than 143 million children in the developing world have been orphaned, equivalent to more than half the population of the United States. And just in the last hour, over 1,600 children were forced to the streets by the death or the abuse of an adult. Over 115 children became prostitutes in the last hour. Over 66 children under the age of 15 were infected with HIV. Roughly 1 billion people in the world do not have suitable housing, and 100 million are entirely homeless. And then we're going to balance that with the American picture here a little bit. She says 780 million people lack basic water sanitation, which results in disease, death, wastewater for drinking, and a loss of immunity. But Americans consume 26 billion liters of bottled water a year. We spend more annually on trash bags than nearly half the world spends on all goods combined. Let that wash over you for a second. 57 million children worldwide work every day instead of going to school, while 4 out of 5 Americans are high school graduates. The poorest 1/5 of the world owns 1% of the world's cars, and the richest 1/5 of the world owns 87% of the world's cars. Roughly 40 million people, the equivalent of about 7 Jewish Holocausts, die annually from starvation, disease, and malnutrition. But 69% of the United States adults and 18% of children and adolescents are overweight or obese. The United States makes up 4.5% of the global population, but we consume 20% of the world's oil. We consume 20 million barrels of oil a day. Next is China at 9 million a day. And 20% of our imported oil comes from the Persian Gulf, and we put military bases on 2 of their 3 Islamic holy sites. And when criticized, one U.S. official replied that the United States must have free access to the region's resources. When a group of leaders from 172 developed nations begged the United States government, the leaders, to explore intervention options for environmental standards, our leaders said, the American way of life is not negotiable. And here's her conclusion from all that. Brand America is in trouble. I ask you humbly, can you see why when Americans say democracy, the world hears greed? What seems like basic freedom to us sounds like vast consumption to everyone else. The tongue-in-cheek first world problems we joke about while lamenting, I just used my last Pandora skip for an hour and the next song is even worse, is part and parcel of the image that we are outsourcing to a suffering planet. We appear indulged and entitled and oblivious to global crisis and our contribution to the disparity. Now, I know that was a lot, and because of our technology, we didn't have a list of those up there, and I don't know if you've heard all that, but the point is this, that I really want to echo that the point is not to make you feel guilty for where you were born. And she does a really excellent job of then saying America also does some really great stuff. $275 billion are given from private and corporate companies to change the world from Americans. We're not all terrible, but here's the thing that I like. She made this, it's like her so what question at the end. She said, we can argue all day long about America, is it balanced, all the bad that we do and the good, and she said, at the end of the day, there's no answer to that. The only answer that's important is what are you doing and what am I doing? Her thesis is that the lack of vibrance that many of us experience in our spiritual life is directly correlated to the fact that our whole spiritual quest is an inward selfish one, instead of an outward loving one, instead of a Christ-like go change the world by serving the poor. She kind of transitions to this passage in Isaiah that I want to read to you before we close our time. And there's a lot more in this book, as you can see, but I'm just trying to hit the highlights. And this passage in Isaiah for her and her husband and their little beautiful community in Austin kind of shaped a vision and a call and really articulated this whole issue. This is in Isaiah 58. And remember this about Isaiah. Isaiah was a really important ancient Jewish prophet. He spoke beautifully of what would work when God's own arm works salvation, and he would be take whippings for our iniquities, and these beautiful prophetic passages. And maybe most importantly, Jesus saw himself as directly fulfilling Isaiah's words. Remember, even when he was at the very beginning of his ministry standing up, he read from the book of Isaiah in a scroll, saying, I'm basically here proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, Anno Domini, where we get AD in our calendar system. He's quoting Isaiah. Isaiah had a very important message that he probably never got to see fulfilled, but this is Isaiah 58, which she hones in on. The first part is God explaining why he's frustrated with Israel. Isaiah says, shout it aloud. Do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion, and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right, and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near to them. I mean, I love that section right there because it is very poignant, and I want to be very clear here and very careful. Do not ever read the Old Testament and put America in the place of Israel. That's just a bad idea. It's not good theology. But that doesn't mean that true concepts that apply to a group of tribal people back then might not also apply to our context. And it doesn't even matter if it's America or Brazil or Europe, fill in the blank. We're looking at true theological ideas. And what Isaiah is calling out is that these people, it seems like they want to know me, and they feel like they're a nation that does everything right. But it says, and they cry out, we have fasted, they say, and you have not seen it. Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. This is harsh stuff from a harsh prophet. He's basically saying, if you continue to ignore the main message that I have for humanity of love and being a called, Israel was called to be God's image to the whole world, that church is for everyone, God is for everyone. He's basically saying, fast all you want, be spiritual all you want, expect to be ignored, which is very, very harsh. He says, is this the kind of fast I have chosen, only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? And here's God's response. Is not this the kind of fasting that I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor or the wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. Then your light will break forth like the dawn. This is the positive part. And your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here I am. He goes on and gushes about how great things would be if we do what? Do what Jesus spent most of his time talking about. Love people. So what? How do we handle a guilty challenge like a book like Jim Hatmaker's or Isaiah's voice calling out to the people long ago, this theme? By the way, just think about, we talked a few weeks ago about the controversial, difficult issue of homosexuality, and I'm not going to go there again, don't worry, you can relax. But it is interesting to think that there are 5 verses in 66-book library that have anything to do with the concept of homosexuality. And there are 2,000 about taking care of the poor. Isn't it strange what we're obsessed with all the time? Isn't that endemic? Isn't that an indictment on how our fascinations lie compared to what the heart of God is fully interested in at all times? I agree with Jim Hatmaker. We cannot ignore the central message of the Bible. It has something to do with equality in the world. A call to be countercultural, a call to challenge the capitalistic mindset of rising to the top at all costs, of descending, living in the poor, and experiencing Christ in the poor. And here's the problem. It's completely overwhelming. All those stats, when I read them, they have zero effect on me at all wanting to go and do something because I feel completely helpless. Does anyone else feel that way? I feel like, what could I possibly do? Vote for a different politician? Maybe go serve at the shelter once a week? It's not going to change those abhorrent, huge numbers. Mother Teresa said something that is so incredible and helpful for us when we think about what we can possibly do with this information. She said, none of us are capable of doing great things, but all of us are capable of doing small things with great love. I heard it in a different way from Andy Stanley a long time ago at a conference, and I think I shared it when I came back from that conference. He said, what you want to do for the whole world, just do for one person. Start there. Don't be overwhelmed. We have a call as a global amoeba of 2.1 billion followers of Christ. We can change the world if we all do small things with great love. Now here's a cool thing. I see that in this community all the time. One of the greatest joys of reading this book is she described kind of the successes in this beautiful journey that she's gone on in Austin, Texas, and she told story after story. I was almost chuckling to myself because I'm going, I see the same thing happening at the Commons in Flagstaff. I see a group of girls who dream up a homeless shelter and they do it. They go get it done. I see another group of ladies who faithfully for years have served at Hope Cottage to those women over there. I think about my wife who gives her life to those who are addicted in drug abuse habits. I think of the guys group that put together twice already big groups of food so they can serve the homeless on the corners. I look out at you guys and go, I'm not here to put guilt on you. I see you living this out. I want to be more like you. Now, we may not all be a part of that. I want to invite you into this, not as a guilt trip, but as a joyful invitation to find the most fulfilling, best version of yourself, because I promise Jen Hatmaker is right. If we allow ourselves to be Americanized to the point that we are inward focused and we're always looking to be fed, because that's my favorite phrase I hear Christians talking about. I'm going to go to this community group, this church, and I just didn't feel fed. I'm just going, that's great. That's not the point. The point is to feed, not to be fed. And literally put food in tummies. You know what I think about? I think about Greta and these girls that hang out in Young Lives and feed babies, and Young Life leaders that go hang out at basketball games and football games. And I think that is the Thessalonians verse. We're delighted not to share with you only the gospel, but our lives as well. I see people in this community doing that, and I commend it. I want to end on this story before we share communion. She told a story. Some of you probably heard of the author Shane Claiborne. I think he wrote a book called Irresistible Revolution, maybe. Might be wrong on that. But he's kind of an emergent church guy, I think. But she met Shane Claiborne one night in Austin, Texas at this small church. They had been at this mega church, and they had 6 Easter services. And then they went downtown on Easter night to this little tiny group of about 150 or 200 people, probably about this group right here. And they had an Easter service where Shane Claiborne was talking about these same kind of things. At the very end of communion, he offered to them, and this is a very unusually cold Austin night at nighttime. It was about 31 degrees. He said, I've just been in San Antonio this morning, and I was meeting with all homeless leaders saying, what do you need? And the biggest need that they had in San Antonio from the homeless community was shoes that were good instead of just leftover secondhand shoes. And he said, so I want to give you an opportunity to invite you, no pressure whatsoever, but at the communion table, you can just leave your shoes up here if you want, and I can actually take them in the morning down there, and we'll get those distributed out. And she and her husband looked at each other and laughed because they were wearing their cowboy boots that they had got each other at Christmas, which were by far the most expensive shoes they had ever owned in their life. But they knew that God was calling them to do something, and they joyfully left their boots behind. But then she tells of walking out that night in Austin and seeing 150 or 200 people walking out barefoot to go home. And she said, that's what church is supposed to look like. Church should be barefoot church. People will take the shoes off their feet because they take seriously that the one who loved them unconditionally and transformed their heart from the inside out and changed everything about who we are calls us to then do the same thing and go love the world like that. See, I think America will continually and continue to be sickened by the online Facebook church of the world, the morality police, fighting the battles. But America and the rest of the world will be captivated by Christians who are white-hot serious about justice. By a barefoot church, people who take the shoes off their feet and go live amongst the poor and listen to the story and not see the poor but see the person. and look into the lives and experience Jesus. How do we know this is true? Because it's not new. That's what made the church explode. That's the heritage of the saints that we have. We have a long lineage, 2,000 years, and billions of Christians who have lived exactly that, who have sacrificed their lives for the poor, and the world has not noticed. They've seen it, and the world has been transformed. And we have to continually be called, and that's why I'm thankful for Jim Hatmaker to call us to remember that, to remember the old thing about what Jesus is and vitalize us. We're going to share communion together, and I thought it'd be neat because she wrote a section in communion about communion in her book. Now, I thought I would let her introduce communion just by reading her section. It's very short. This is what she says about it. If I can find the bookmark. She says, she's talking about Jesus at the night that he was betrayed. She says, not only does Jesus' statement require a constant response, but remembrance is from amnesis. This is the Greek word, meaning to make real. That's what remembrance comes from. Communion is more than a memory, and it's more than a reverent moment when we recall Jesus' heroic sacrifice. Remembrance means honoring Jesus' mercy mission with tangible physical action, since it was a tangible physical sacrifice. In other words, constantly make this real. Now she quotes scripture. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then again, now you are the body of Christ. And then she closes with this paragraph. Not only was communion a symbolic ritual, it was a new prototype of discipleship. Continuously make my sacrifice real by doing this very thing. Become broken and poured out for hopeless people. Become a living offering, denying yourself for the salvation and restoration of humanity. Obedience to Jesus' command is more than looking backward. It's a present and continuous replication of his sacrifice. We don't simply remember the meal, we become the meal. I'm going to pray over these elements, and we have 4 different places where we celebrate the communion table as an open sacrament that anyone, especially the farthest out, is welcome at the table of the Lord. We also believe it's an optional sacrament. There might be many reasons you choose to abstain, and that's completely okay. I'm going to pray over these elements, and you're invited to come partake of this meal. God, I thank you for what you're doing in Austin, Texas. Thanks for Brandon Hatmaker and Jim Hatmaker. Thank you that they listened as they opened your words. Thank you that you blessed them along the way with your presence as they experienced the marginalized, as they lived out your call to us. God, thank you that they saw your face and then she shared that face with us. God, we come together at the communion table recognizing, Father, it's not just us in this room, but it's their church in Austin and every church around this world that has celebrated this sacrament for so long, God. As always, we begin by asking you, Father, to please forgive us of our many sins. God, we ask you to forgive us for the things that we have done that hurt you, and hurt others, and hurt ourselves. And we also ask you today to forgive us for the things that we had not done that would have helped others and changed the world. And God, because your body was broken and because your blood was spilled, we receive forgiveness of those sins. And we always thank you, God, that we have not yet been able to, nor will we ever able to out-sin your unconditional love. So we receive that grace and that love. And God, today, as we look at these passages of Scripture, will you help us be more than that, as we're keenly aware of your presence and the oneness we experience sharing this meal. Help us to model after you as we become the meal, to take the challenge of emptying ourselves and descending and loving in the way that you loved us. Thank you for this time. I've been obsessed with this Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War. Anybody ever seen that? Any of you that have been around me, that's all I talk about for the last few weeks, so I watch it every night. But I was intrigued by the one story about the beginning of the Civil War. There was a guy named John Brown, and a lot of you probably know this if you're historians at all, but he went to a church service, and the pastor there took a risk and talked about the blatant sin that slavery was, even though it's contained in a lot of the biblical texts. And many Southern churches were preaching that you cannot challenge slavery, it's God instituted. Biblically, this pastor said no. And this guy, John Brown, who failed at everything in life, 6 businesses, bankruptcy, family, nothing had gone well. He actually stood up in the back of the church, he raised his hand and said, I want to give my entire life to stopping this evil slavery. Now, he didn't do everything right, and he's weird, and history can sort out if he was the right guy or not, but his passion was clear. He was a white guy that wanted to give his life for slavery. At Harper's Ferry, at the very eastern side of Western Virginia, he got together with about 5 African Americans. Some were freed slaves, some were fugitives, a couple white guys, and they sieged an armory. And ultimately, it was the beginning of the Civil War. In fact, many historians have said, at least on this documentary, which is the source of all truth, they said that this was the central thing that was the fissure in the great fault line of slavery that brought it to its head. It was this guy, John Brown. He died. He ended up being hanged for treason after his 2 sons were killed. And in fact, Robert E. Lee was a U.S. at the time. He was a U.S. general that was called in to stop this treason. But Frederick Douglass, one of the most influential black voices, said that, I would live my life to stop slavery, but John Brown would give his life to stop slavery. What's my point? My point is this. I hope that you'll read this book. That's the whole point of the book club series, is to pique your interest. I hope you'll be challenged by it, but I hope you'll raise your hand and say, whatever I do, I want to be about serving the oppressed. Because in doing that, you will be like Jesus. You will love, and the world will see that as the message of Christ. Now here's my final thought for you. Do not do that alone. One of the best parts of this book is the way she weaves the story of being transformed in heart to go serve the poor, and then gathering a community around together of small groups that host mom days out and then go serve in the soup kitchen and do all sorts of crazy creative things to serve a suffering world, and they do it together. So here's my challenge. Do that together. Talk about it at dinner tonight. Talk about it in your community group. If you're not in a community group, get in a community group and start talking about this, to live a missional life. Be missionaries in your neighborhood, in your workplace, so that we will look a lot like Jesus. Do it together. Now, tonight, a couple of announcements transitioning from that. Tonight we have soccer is moving. If you're going to play soccer tonight, we're going back to the south fields because the lights are on, which is sweet, which means we can start a little later. So it's 7:30, we're going to get to the south fields to play soccer under the lights, which means you can go grab a bite to eat. Don't forget the queue on Tuesday night. I would love to see you there. By the way, what's cool about that, that's one of our community groups nights that they usually meet. And that's going to be an open time. So that might be another great place if you're looking at a way to get plugged in and go to a community group, to show up at the queue on Tuesday night and have some open discussion. Let me pray for you guys and we will take off. God, thank you for this family. Thank you for the fact that we can celebrate so many in this room who have raised their hand and lived a life that shows your truth of loving the poor. God, I pray for more of that. I pray that you will be working in our hearts and moving towards our hands so that we might change the world with small acts of great love. We love you and thank you for your word.